hopefully the test is not too difficult and you'll do well. So today I'm going to talk about, for some reason, I don't know why, when I share this, okay, great. The recordings are posted and I'll give you the slides as well, and hopefully you can access the PDFs for the readings. It's all online, so it's sometimes I just have to hope that everyone can access the materials, because if it was in person, then I could distribute like a course package of the printed readings. But hopefully, if for some reason you can't access or download the readings, you can go to Google Scholar. So all of the readings are available to download for free from Google Scholar. So if for some reason you can't access the PDFs that I send because of the files, you can go to Google Scholar and just enter the name of the reading into Google Scholar, and the name, all of the readings are posted on the course outline, where I've written all of the names of the readings on the course outline. So this week we're going to discuss fungability, and so the reading is listed on the course syllabus, and it's a reading by Io Awera called Attempting Redress, Fungability, Ethics, and Redressive Practices in the Work of Saidiya Hartman. So I might have spelled fungability wrong. It should be, I think, Fungibility. It's actually a concept from economics, and it's a concept that looks at commodities that are movable. So what Saidiya Hartman argues is that slavery turns enslaved peoples into fungible commodities. So in economics, the idea of a fungible commodity is a commodity that can be moved or can be used in different ways. So in economics, fungibility is the idea that a unit of commodity can be exchanged for another unit of the same type. It's a key principle in economics that applies to money, gold, stocks, bonds, and other commodities. So, for example, a gold nugget can be exchanged for a gold coin as long as both contain the same amount of gold. And so Hartman is interested in the ways that enslaved people could be exchanged for other enslaved people, or enslaved people could be exchanged for indentured people. And people who are sold into slavery could be exchanged for each other. Countering the popular fantasy that the 13th Amendment marked the end of slavery's reign, Sexton, and this is Anne Sexton, who is a really well-cited feminist philosopher in the United States of America. So Anne Sexton, along with Saidiya Hartman, Frank Wilderson, and others, have articulated what Hartman calls the continuities of slavery and freedom, the ways in which the legal, social, political, and emotional structures of slavery have been reinscribed throughout an allegedly post-slavery society and its global neoliberal dominion, highlighting how anti-Blackness constitutes the condition of possibility for the United States itself. Within this predicament, Sexton argues social movements of non-Black people invariably are comprised by seeking redress from a political system hell-bent and built on the destruction of Black life. So what these authors are actually arguing and discussing from is really similar to Marxist theory, and it can be explained in Marxist theory that they're arguing that this kind of foundation of slavery and settler colonialism really shapes all forms of hierarchy in the Americas. That Black people's lives, because of the history of slavery, are always kind of exchangeable as people who are working class or poor. And every other group of people who is not Black can try to obtain some sort of class mobility. And Sexton is a feminist writer, and so many feminist writers have looked at the ways that non-Black and non-Indigenous women and queer people can obtain some level of, say, middle class status. But this doesn't really change the foundations of North America's economy, which are largely about settler colonialism and slavery. And so this is similar to what Indigenous scholars and scholars writing about, especially in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report, have argued, is that as settlers, all settlers can essentially profit from a settler economy, but this will not change the ways that Indigenous peoples have historically been discriminated against. And as settlers who are immigrants or children of immigrants, settlers can expand and can develop modern business, but there will always be these questions of land claims. So irrespective of whether you are a person of color or a woman or queer, your relationship to settler colonialism and slavery will always define your class position, unless there is substantial institutional and federal government redress in the form of, say, economic reparations or in the form of redistribution of what some would say is stolen land. This is why there are movements called land back and movements for economic reparations. So the author writes, how might we bring these analyses to bear in our critique of the ascendancy of neoliberal LGBT political and cultural practices? A growing number of critical thinkers, such as Lisa Dugan and Jasper Puar, have worked to theorize homonormativity and homonationalism in the United States in an effort to disarticulate LGBT political claims from the absorptive thrall of late capital. Simultaneously, we are witnessing the proliferation and expansion of racial and economic justice focused LGBT activist formations, challenging the status quo of state violence and structural adjustment, both in terms of what issues and constituencies are centered within LGBT political work, as well as the ways in which the processes of organizing and movement building replicates racial norms and domination. So the idea of settlement itself and the extension of rights to, say, queer people in Turtle Island or in the context of settler colonialism expands process of settlement. So there will be more and more people who want to own property, who want to settle, and who want to expand business. And while this is something that is obviously positive from an objective perspective, that more people want to immigrate to Canada. Canada has comprehensive transgender rights. Bill C-16 adds gender identity and gender expression to the Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code. This kind of expansion and this kind of development of modern capitalism obviously happens at the same time that there have been more documented cases of Indigenous women and girls who go missing or are murdered, and it happens uh, at the same time that there are these really basic human rights questions about water scarcity in Indigenous communities. So these questions are then also asked by the author of this week's readings in regards to anti-Black racism and the history of slavery. So the fundamental question that these authors want to ask, and many of the authors from the syllabus ask, is about history and about historical wrongs. To what extent can we bear responsibility, moral, social, political, and economic responsibility for historical wrongs? The fungibility of enslaved peoples, the trading of actual persons in the slave trade, is obviously a violation of every human rights law and of morality, and it really shapes the idea of who is a free person and who has a life, as opposed to who is enslaved and who can be a commodity. However, the question becomes, how do we, or can we, account for these historical wrongs, and how do we account for these historical wrongs? So what the author argues is that contemporary anti-Black racism and the politics of policing Black people's lives is directly connected to the history of slavery. The supplemental anti-Blackness of the United States junior partners, those whose grievances might be addressed, however, incompletely by rights, to which we might add non-Black LGBTQ people, functions hand in hand with the systemic state and parastate violence targeted at Black people. The tactics of crowding out Black claims and the tactics of actively terrorizing Black people are two wings of the same endeavor. Because Blackness and criminality are wedded in the U.S. lexicon, as Saidiya Hartman argues in her book Scenes of Subjection, any claims to not being a criminal, or on the flip side, to being a citizen, must literally be made on the backs of Black people. When rights-seeking constituencies claim they are not criminals, they articulate their bid for inclusion through an implicit assertion that they are not Black. Even if the articulation is made on behalf of a group that supposedly does not exclude Black members, as Sexton and Wilderson argue, such an assertion enters a system of meaning that necessarily signifies the group as non-Black and appeals for a chance to participate in anti-Blackness. So what the author argues then is that in order to claim rights as a free person and a person who can own property, uh, every group of people who attempts to take their place as a settler and a free person is making a claim that they are not Black. And I would argue that settlers in North America are also settlers who make a claim to be free people who can participate in modern capitalism, and a claim that they are not then part of Indigenous people's lives in many ways. And this kind of claim is made through efforts to settle land and to also to espouse a rhetoric of Canadian nationalism. And this happens over and over again because Canada has such a strong set of human rights laws that support every group of people, including transgender people and queer people, people of color, because Canada is often seen to be a great place for immigrants, then the claims of Indigenous people are often not taken seriously, or they are overshadowed by this kind of constant positive branding of Canada as being this amazing place for every person in the world to immigrate to. And this kind of rhetoric, then, I would argue, is what allows Indigenous people's claims to be unheard, or also what allows people to pathologize Indigenous people and to not take their claims of human rights violations seriously. So we have discussed biopolitics in previous lectures, and what I have argued is that the state invests in certain lives while they simultaneously enact what Achille Mbembe will call necropolitics, which is to divest in others' people's lives. So the investment in every family formation, including transgender families and queer families, happens at the same time that Canada has faced a series of ongoing lawsuits and complaints by Indigenous women who argue that they have been forcibly sterilized by nurses and doctors in the Canadian healthcare system. So Saidiya Hartman has argued that the transatlantic slave trade constructed a notion of blackness that is fundamentally fungal and criminal, making blackness permanently available for the full enjoyment of white people, and making black people always already guilty in the eyes of law, incapable of being violated. The civil and social death of black people forms the basis on which white life and citizenship becomes knowable, their compass and their shadow. Whiteness must be constantly yoked to the future and victimhood, while blackness must be yoked to death and pathology. I think the author I think the author's name is Saidiya. I think many of us can agree that we are living. Saidiya Hartman has been praised as one of our most. Saidiya. So I think the author's name is Saidiya Hartman. It's important to try to show respect to the authors that we'll be looking at and their work. So Saidiya Hartman then has written about the fungability of the black body, and the civil and social death of black people forms the basis on which white life and citizenship becomes knowable, their compass and their shadow. Whiteness must be constantly yoked to the future and victimhood, while blackness must be yoked to death and pathology. The story of endangered white futurity endangers black negativity. The sexual politics that motors anti-blackness can be found on every channel. Lauren Berlant has explored how the celebrated figure of the feminized white child at risk of racialized violence in the post-Reagan era years has been mobilized to justify claims to state protection and citizenship. So this kind of futurity of, say, the Canadian nation state involves this inclusion of every group of oppressed peoples or minorities, while at the same time there are these really horrific cases such as the murder of Cindy Gladue. And this kind of inclusion of, say, immigrants and queer people and transgender people and people with disabilities happens at the same time that there are these really traumatic instances of the torture of people like Cindy Gledoux, and also then the constant debasement of her life by judges and by lawyers, and as I've said, by media depictions of her as being someone who is a criminal. So I would argue that there's a similarity in this kind of foundational violence, this ongoing necropolitics that is needed to invest in the lives of settlers. And I would argue that it is similar to what um, authors discuss as the foundational anti-blackness that is needed to structure a white futurity that we can all participate in North America. Any account of the anti-black framework of the Gay and Lesbian Rights Project must identify the centrality of claims to what critical race theorists call formal legal equality as a key technology of its anti-blackness. So there have been a lot of interesting discussions regarding neoliberal feminism and neoliberal queer rights. Um, and Lola Olufemi uh, wrote a book. Lola Olufemi is a British writer and an organizer with the London Feminist Library, and has written a book called Feminism Interrupted, Disrupting Power. And Olufemi's book looks at the ways that the feminist movement became aligned with the most mainstream and often the most competitive goals of capitalism in the 1990s. So neoliberalism, as I've discussed in previous lectures, refers to a new form of liberalism. So what liberal means is free. So if we have liberal views, we have really free views that we believe that people should be free to say, do what they want with their lives. And this kind of neoliberalism, though, is also a capitalist value that we believe in a free market. So if you want to sell your labor at any time, you can. If you want to go on the internet and find ways to make money, you can. If you want to move, you can. You can also spend your money in whatever way you want. And the 1990s ushered in this time of neoliberal capitalism. And it also corresponds to the rise of the internet. So the internet allows us to kind of buy and sell freely. So neoliberal feminism for Olufemi is this project in which people are also free to market themselves and use their identity to sell themselves. The problem is that not everyone is going to be as successful a capitalist as everyone else. And so Olufemi argues that middle class and wealthy women and middle class and wealthy queer and transgender people can market themselves using the internet, using consumer culture, but that this also happens with the rise of homelessness, poverty, um, the rise in severe mental health issues that often lead to suicide or severe addiction issues that kill people at a young age. This also corresponds to the rise of groups of people who are stateless, who are survivors of war and are literally going to or have no capacity to imagine their future because of war or persecution, but also might have difficulty claiming citizenship within a Western country. So I would argue that the rise of identity politics and the rise of kind of identity claims for people of color, for the children of middle class and wealthy immigrants, corresponds to more and more gruesome cases like the murder of Cindy Gladue, and more kind of really bitter debates regarding land claims in Canada and regarding expansion. So the Wet'suwet'en conflict, which disrupted Canada's rail system, is an example of this kind of schism between the rise of, say, multiculturalism, or the realization of multiculturalism, which has led to more and more middle class and wealthy, say, people of color, and also the realization of transgender and queer rights. That if you go to Canada, it sometimes seems like utopian for minorities, but at the same time, there is always this kind of remainder because of neoliberal capitalism. And the protests regarding Wet'suwet'en um, led to a lot of really antagonistic politics in Canada in 2020. So rail lines were paralyzed for weeks after being blockaded by Indigenous protesters and their supporters. The blockades were put in place in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en First Nation hereditary chiefs who oppose a natural gas pipeline in their traditional territory in the province of British Columbia. The conflict began after police enforced a court injunction to clear Wet'suwet'en camps, blocking a road leading to a work site for the pipeline. The economic impact of the rail blockade is beginning to be felt across industries, and there are concerns about shortages of goods. Uh, the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was under pressure to solve the conflict as trains remain idle. So the Coastal Link pipeline is a 670-kilometer, it's 416 miles project that would ship natural gas from northeastern parts of BC to the coast. And the project costs 6.6 billion Canadian dollars, and it is in a remote part of the province outside of Vancouver. While the conflict is in part over opposition to the pipeline project, it is also about broader complex issues like Indigenous rights, Indigenous governance, and truth and reconciliation. The larger ideological question is about control and ownership of property. Who owns Canada's Indigenous lands? Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs oppose Coastal GasLink and the use of their land for a pipeline, and claim they hold authority over a bigger expanse of traditional lands, not just reserve land over which the election councils have no jurisdiction. So in February of 2020, the RCMP enforced a court injunction and cleared the camps, arresting people in the process. And there have been these ongoing debates regarding pipelines on Indigenous land. The debates are also about environmental degradation and about economics and the spending of millions of dollars for pipelines. So, legal equality arguments have often been used in debates regarding identity politics. And these arguments are really about rights, the rights of individuals. But there are obviously a whole set of other arguments regarding land and environmental destruction and economic growth. There are also debates regarding just the treatment of women, and specifically Indigenous women and Black women, who are often most likely to be crimes of extreme violence, including police violence and including sexual violence and trafficking and forced forced labor and forcing the forcing of young Indigenous women into the sex trade is also something that has been documented in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report. This has also been true of anti-Black racism against Black women and girls. So legal equality arguments require those making them both to articulate existing legal structures as generally fair and neutral, but for the exclusion focused on, and to portray the excluded group as a population that deserves inclusion. This work constructs desirable and undesirable populations, those deserving a chance at life and reproduction, and those whose exile, imprisonment, or death is acceptable or even important for the survival of the nation. So again, this kind of binary between the included and the excluded is a form of biopolitics. And Foucault argued that biopolitics is a way that the state governs by administering life, by granting life to some. But as Achille Mbembe argues, and Achille Mbembe is a post-colonial scholar who is based in South Africa, and Mbembe argues that the state also does not administer life to certain populations. The state actually actively excludes certain populations from having access to really basic amenities like housing or food security in order to divest from certain lives. And so this inclusion of certain people as ideal settlers who are middle class settlers, as opposed to the exclusion of others, is really clear when we look at the statistics of things like sterilization and poverty among Indigenous peoples, and in cases of extreme violence against Indigenous women like Cindy Gladue. The author argues that LGBTQ rights, like neoliberal feminism, can be used to celebrate Canada and celebrate America as countries that offer greater human rights for oppressed peoples, but this also happens at the same time that there are more and more instances of police violence against Black people, and it also happens as there are these really aggressive efforts to seize Indigenous land for the building of pipelines. The emergence of the demand for LGBT inclusive hate crime laws and the accomplishment of the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act as a highly lauded federal legislative win for lesbian and gay rights offers a particularly blatant sight of the anti-Blackness central to lesbian and gay rights, literally an investment in the expansion of criminalization as a core claim and desire of this purported freedom. In the context of the foundational nature of slavery in U.S. political formation, it is perhaps not surprising to see a political formation of white, gay, and lesbian Americans articulate a demand for freedom that is contingent on the literal occasion of Black people. This is similar to these protests at Wet'suwet'en. In 2000, in the years before these protests, there were lots of debates regarding transgender rights in Canada. Canada passed, I would argue, the most progressive and impressive rights for transgender people, I think, in the world. And this is really impressive, but it also happens at the same time that there are these efforts by the federal government of Canada to expand across Indigenous lands using pipelines and to really ignore the claims of hereditary chiefs regarding Indigenous sovereignty and ownership of land. Gay marriage and lesbian marriage and same-sex and queer rights have also been used by political leaders who want to seem progressive, while at the same time the economic rights and the housing security of many Black people, specifically in historically Black neighborhoods, have been called into question or have been ignored. So more broadly, the articulation of the fight for same-sex marriage or gay and lesbian rights generally as a frontier of civil rights, or sometimes the final frontier of the civil rights movement. This analogy, of course, heavily relies on the idea that the civil rights movement successfully freed Black people and made them equal, and thus gay and lesbian rights can be framed as a new frontier since the others have been accomplished. So this isn't really a conspiracy or anything personal, it is about capitalism. Marx argued that the ruling ideology of our time is always the ideology of the ruling class. And the more that there are middle class and wealthy queer people, middle class and wealthy transgender people, middle class and wealthy Asian and South Asian Canadians, then the ideology will reflect their interests. The ideology will, however, not reflect the interests of the working class. And when one has been historically enslaved or dispossessed of their land or been a victim of psychological violence in the school system, then it will be difficult for certain groups of people who have been historically marginalized again and again to be part of the ruling class. Recall that decisive check mark next to African American on the poster we invoked earlier. The trope maintains that other populations, especially Black people, have been freed by legal equality, and now it is time to complete the project of American freedom by granting legal equality to apparently non-Black lesbian and gay people. The triumphant and well-circulated claim that gay is the new Black performs dual labor. First, it disappears the unspectacular and enduring condition of Black suffering that persists in the neoliberal era. Secondly, it appropriates the apparently satisfied struggle of Black people. And I would argue that this kind of inclusion, the idea that equal rights can be extended to all, is the same as a general kind of capitalist argument that there can be new housing developments and new pipelines and new economic projects. And the kind of violence that settler colonialism has done to the environment and to human rights is something that is kind of bracketed and discussed in reports, while there continue to be these kind of economic projects and projects of economic development that are also protested against and challenged by allies of Indigenous rights, or allies for Indigenous rights, and by Indigenous peoples. So the essential question that is being raised from a philosophical perspective by all of these authors is about inclusion as opposed to the radical transformation of capitalism itself. And it is obviously much easier to imagine that more and more people who are minorities will be, or who were once, say, minorities, will be added to this kind of happy capitalist family. It is more, I guess, expedient to think about the ways that we can all be included in modern industries and as modern legal subjects and as modern families and as consumers and producers. However, is it sustainable? The problems of environmental degradation are really some of the most kind of pressing questions that offer a really cogent critique of capitalist expansion and of economic development without any consideration of what pipeline projects will do to land over time and what they will do to our quality of air and water. Critical race theorists have supplied the concept of preservation through transformation to describe the neat tricks that civil rights law performed in this dynamic. In the face of significant resistance to conditions of subjection, law reform tends to provide just enough transformation to stabilize and preserve status quo conditions. In the case of widespread Black rebellion against white supremacy in the U.S., civil rights law and colorblind constitutionalism have operated as formal reforms that masked a perpetuation of the status quo of violence against and exploitation of Black people. So the civil rights arguments are really arguments about the social welfare state. And Canada is still in a position to advance arguments for human rights because of our social welfare state. Unlike the United States of America, Canada has comprehensive free health care, universal health care for everyone in Canada. We also have a really strong social welfare state that prevents people from being incarcerated because of poverty or because of credit card debt. And so we can still obviously think of a social welfare state model that does not use rights to, on the one hand, consistently ask people to sell their labor and compete without any guarantees. Critical race theorists have helped identify the inadequacy of the discrimination principle that is central to the failing of formal legal equality to deliver material relief from racism. The discrimination principle conceptualizes racial harm as individual manifestations of bias in activities like hiring, firing, leasing, selling, or serving. This approach to understanding and addressing racism relies on at least two harmful assumptions. Firstly, that race consciousness on the part of both people of color and white people, not intergenerational structures of white supremacy, is the problem that the law must eliminate, leaving color blindness in its place, contributing to the dismantling of programs seeking to address disparities such as affirmative action. So the idea of color blindness, of sameness, that we are all kind of trying to ignore history, is, I guess, one of the issues in thinking about how people approach critical race theory. And it is interesting to think about from the perspective of decolonization in the context of settler Canada and after the release of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report, that we are not really trying to pretend that Indigenous peoples are not Indigenous peoples in Canada. So in the absence of explicit intentional exclusion, courts rarely find a violation of discrimination law. Most Black people who have been denied a job, apartment, or access to public accommodation cannot produce evidence of intent required, not to mention that most people for whom such losses might produce the worst consequences cannot afford an attorney. So this kind of evidence begins from the fact that there is colorblindness, that the history of slavery is kind of not important anymore. And this argument, I think, is really not something that could happen in the context of settler Canada unless there are violations of laws and federal laws, that one must acknowledge the history of settler colonialism, the acknowledgement of land claims, the acknowledgement of theft, and the acknowledgement of the long history of the persecution of Indigenous peoples in the Canadian school system through forced residential schooling is something that must take place in every institution. So the second faulty assumption underlying the discrimination principle is that the law itself can remedy the most significant conditions of white supremacy. The broad conditions of extreme racial disparity in access to housing, employment, education, food, and healthcare, and severe disproportionality in criminal punishment, environmental damage, and immigration enforcement are cast as natural and inevitable by the discrimination principle. So this kind of discrimination principle is really about the law. And so can equal rights challenge racism? If we were to think about this in the context of this class about Indigenous issues, the problem is the law would extend the rights of to participate in modern capitalism to all settlers. The Wet'suwet'en protests are not about the right of, say, transgender people to work on a pipeline. They are about the pipeline itself. And so these claims of affirmative action as the extension of modern capitalist rights do not hold true in settler Canada, because environmental degradation is actually more of a fundamental question. That if the right to kind of build more and more luxury homes, build more and more swimming pools, and build more and more pipelines is extended to all of us, then in the future our air quality, our food quality, our actual quality of living as people who must breathe and eat and sleep and drink water will be called into question, or will be threatened by unfettered capitalist growth without any thought of sustainability. So the centrality of legal equality claims to gay and lesbian rights politics and specific investments of them in accessing and expanding key institutions of anti-Blackness is often accomplished through the deployment of a like-Black civil rights analogy. Sexton observes that this analogy is a key technology of anti-Blackness. And so the point is that people often kind of make these equivalences, that one group of people is like another. So the claims of, say, transgender and queer people are like the claims of Black Americans during the civil rights era. And these arguments position one group as being against each other, but they also make the argument that civil rights have been achieved. And so Sexton observes that this analogy is a key technology of anti-Blackness in non-Black social movements. Sexton describes the peculiar, long-standing, and cross-racial phenomenon where a range of struggles allegorize themselves to revolts against slavery. Meanwhile, the suffering of Black people during slavery and its afterlife is something perpetually figured as already known and addressed, not needing to be further discussed, and of course, mainly historical. So I think the author is actually citing Jared Sexton. Um, it should be in the footnotes of the reading. I'll find out and I'll tell you next class. I was thinking of someone else who's an author with the same name. The point is, though, that this kind of rights-based discourse is really interesting for us to critique in the context of settler Canada and Indigenous studies. So the Wet'suwet'en First Nation and Indigenous people in British Columbia are experiencing environmental degradation due to climate change and other environmental issues. And so the building of the pipeline has already caused environmental destruction and cut the Wet'suwet'en people off from their ancestral territory. So the pipeline is also about really basic environmental questions like water scarcity and the destruction of water resources. And the Wet'suwet'en people are unable to perform many of their traditional activities, such as hunting and fishing, because the forest has been damaged by construction sites. So this kind of transfer of rights from one movement to another, or from one group of people to another, overlooks really, really important and fundamental issues regarding environmental destruction and regarding capitalism and capitalist expansion itself. That money and the creation of more and more industry is automatically thought to be an undisputed good. But what many environmental activists and advocates for Indigenous peoples would look at are the long-term problems with capitalist expansion on Indigenous land in the form of things like pipelines and gas lines. So, Saidiya Hartman writes that care is the antidote to violence. The demands on the slave, the demands of the slave on the present have everything to do with making good the promise of abolition. And this entails much more than the end of property and slaves. So the afterlife of the transatlantic slave trade and settler colonialism ends with capitalist expansion and with our constant desire to see success in economic terms and to constantly try to find ways to market ourselves and sell our labor. However, it also ends with global climate change and ongoing threats to our basic security, such as the global pandemic, and more and more questions of food scarcity, housing scarcity, air quality, and mental health and physical health. So I would argue that this time, like any other, is a good time to revisit the Marxist canon and conflict theory and to question the ways that unfettered capitalist growth will not lead to sustainable forms of life and to sustainable forms of happiness. So I'll finish there. And I guess, do you have any questions about the test? Because this is the first test that you are being asked to participate in, or the first assignment you're being asked to complete for the class. I know that it can be sometimes stressful to have to complete work, and it is the first assignment, but hopefully I will grade the test answers within a week, so you'll hand them in next week, and then I'll grade them within a week so you can see the grading, and I think that everyone should do well. This is only a second year level class, so the requirements are just that you try to engage with the course material and that you don't need a title page. However, you are asked to submit a works cited to demonstrate your use of a scholarly method of citation. You can submit a Word document or a PDF. It doesn't, as long as the answers are legible, you can use whatever font you would like to. However, please try to write in full sentences, as this is an academic writing exercise. Are there any other questions? You are asked to give a definition of the concept. This can be directly from the readings. Then you are asked to discuss the relevance of the concept to Indigenous issues. You can, again, cite directly from the readings or lectures. For example, you could discuss fungability in relation to wet Suwatan. But you can also come up with your own answer. The test is due anytime on February 6th, before midnight is the deadline that I've set on. I've set the deadline on Blackboard. So the term fungability, I think should be spelled like this. So I'll actually update the test. So spelled properly. Sorry, I just caught this typo. Yeah, it should be fungability. So I'll update the test online right now. So sorry about that, but once there are typos, you won't be penalized severely as well if you make a typo or two in your test. It's okay. Are there any other questions? The guidelines have already been sent to you. I've explained the test at the beginning of the lecture. So this is the test, and I spent the first, I guess, half hour explaining the test. So here are the guidelines, and the test has already been sent to you over messages, and it's posted under course content on the course website. So please look there. I have to end the class now because I teach another class after this. So please email me if you have any further questions. Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.